From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 52. I hope this finds everybody safe and sound wherever you may be. We're going to do our best to keep bringing you some good content to keep your mind off of some of the crazy things that are happening in this world, but we are sending good vibes out to everybody wherever you may be. With that said, we've got a great guest today. He brings a wealth of experience from both the private sector and Major League Baseball. And more specific to today's discussion, he actually has a ton of research that he's performed and contributed to with respect to baseball injuries in the professional ranks. So I think we're in for a lot of really good information. I know I learned a lot from this interview, and I'm sure you will too. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients to support your body's nutritional needs across 5 critical areas: energy, immunity, gut health, hormonal support, and healthy aging. I'm an avid user of Athletic Greens myself, in spite of the fact that I tend to be a supplement minimalist. To me, this is a product that is much more like whole food nutritional insurance as opposed to a true supplement. The ingredients have been carefully selected at the highest quality, most natural source. You get essential vitamins and minerals, digestive enzymes, prebiotics, probiotics, and that's the zero compromise approach from the company. It's plant-based, sourced from whole foods at the highest qualities. You won't find harmful chemicals, artificial colors or flavors, preservatives, or added sugar. Really, it's perfect for folks who are gluten and dairy-free, paleo, keto, vegan-friendly, great for people who are intermittent fasting, all that fun stuff. Personally, I love it for obviously our athletes who don't get enough nutritional benefits from fruits and vegetables because they don't eat enough. So it's a way to kind of plug in holes in diets. But also, I really like it for our college and professional athletes who may have complex travel schedules where quality food options aren't always at hand. On a personal level, I'm a husband, father of 3, and an entrepreneur. We split our time between 2 states, and I'm also still an avid lifter. So life is inherently crazy, and it can be stressful, and sleep deprivation is definitely something that we encounter. So I rely on Athletic Greens for part of my immune support, and believe firmly that it's made a big difference in keeping me healthy in spite of how crazy our lifestyle is. They've got a great offer in place. If you head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey, they'll get you 20 free travel packets with your purchase. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY, and you can claim your special offer. Today's guest is a licensed physical therapist and athletic trainer with 23 years of Major League Baseball experience. After receiving his undergraduate degree at Cal State University Northridge, he followed up with a doctorate in physical therapy from Boston University. He spent 4 years as a captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps as a physical therapist, and then started his own private practice physical therapy clinic. He would expand to own, operate, and consult with 7 different physical therapy clinics in 3 different states. Eventually, he turned his attention to professional baseball in 1993 and worked for the San Francisco Giants in a multitude of positions, including physical therapist, rehabilitation, strength and conditioning coordinator, head athletic trainer, and director of medical services. He moved on to the Los Angeles Dodgers in 2006 as the director of medical services and head athletic trainer before becoming the vice president of medical service in 2012. He has authored or co-authored 20 studies published in different medical journals with a heavy focus on injuries to professional and collegiate baseball players. He serves on multiple Major League Baseball research committees, including the prestigious UCL Research Committee, and was a founding member of the MLB Electronic Medical Records Committee. He was also named as an advisor to PitchSmart.org. In 2012, he was awarded the ASMI Andrews Career Achievement Award by Dr. Andrews. He serves as an adjunct faculty member at Cal State University Northridge in the physical therapy department and in the physical therapy program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He now works alongside his son, Nick, at Conte Sports Performance in Phoenix, Arizona. Please welcome to the show, Stan Conte. Welcome to the show, Stan.
Hi, Eric. How's it going?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us. I'm very excited for this.
I appreciate you asking me.
So
I got the privilege of watching you give a few talks at the American Sports Medicine Institute conference here in January, and got a good chance to throw some ideas around in the lobby between talks. And you are a guy that has a wealth of knowledge, not just because of the intense focus on the research world of late, but also obviously your experience in professional baseball, and it's given you a unique perspective. So let's talk a little about your journey over the decades in professional baseball. Where did it begin? Where did it wind up? And what were the evolutions in the game that you observed, particularly with respect to how injuries were diagnosed, classified, and reported?
Well, first of all, I actually started after physical therapy school at Cal State University Northridge, and I volunteered for the U.S. Army. Spent 4 years as a PT in the Army, and I got to tell you, I learned 10 years of orthopedics in 4 years. One of the greatest things I did out of school. Eventually went into private practice in San Francisco. I was involved in 7 different clinics around the Bay Area, and saw a lot of San Francisco Giants baseball players. That's kind of how I got into baseball.
Mm-hmm.
They started asking me to come up and see their players and rehab their players. And at that particular time, which was interesting, you'll note that there was no strength and conditioning programs or strength and conditioning personnel, but there also was no physical therapist. There was I think I was the second, maybe the third PT that was involved with a Major League Baseball team. Pat Screener with the Dodgers and Tom Prost, who's still with the Rockies. He may have been ahead of me. I don't know. I would have to talk about the dates. But then, so my journey really into baseball started then in the early 1990s, and learned quite a bit about the differences between rehabbing a player in the clinic and rehabbing a player to get them back on the field. I really believed at that time I really had a great ideas of being able to put players on the field from the clinic, and found out I wasn't even close. Mm-hmm. So we learned a whole lot about not just rehabbing an injury, but actually the objective of putting the player on the field and returning the player at their previous level of performance. So that was that took me about 5 years to even get an idea of what it was. It was amazing. And so I eventually became the head trainer and physical therapist with the Giants. And then I left the Giants in 2006 and went to the Dodgers. Mm-hmm. My neighbors still don't talk to me being a Giants fan and going to the Dodgers. And then spent 9 years with the Dodgers, and then I resigned. I didn't retire. I resigned after the 2016 season, and really to kind of concentrate on seeing my family again. As you know, it's not a whole lot of fun traveling all over the country after 3 or 4 years, and to do more research. I think one of the interesting things, and I'll tell a quick story here about how I got into research in the first place. I really wasn't a researcher, really a clinician, and in 1996, I was about my third year with the Giants, and we had a new GM, Brian Sabian, who came in. The Giants were just terrible. They had lost 94 games that year, and it was just a mess. And I was called up to his office, which I thought was to be fired since everything was so bad. And he said, we don't have the money to replace injured players. Can you stop all these injuries? And of course, without a hesitation, I said, well, of course I can. And of course, I had no idea. So what was interesting is so I went back and I said, okay, we got to develop some programs. Let's see how many injuries there were. And this isn't way back in 1996. Well, nobody had them. Nobody knew how many injuries there were. And it took me about 3 years to finally uncover the disabled list, which nobody seemed to know about at the time, and find out what injuries were. And I was excited at that, and they had it by teams and everything else. It was broken down by money and everything else. And I decided I should write an article to let people know how many injuries were in baseball. So we wrote this article in 2001. And what happened was our data showed that injuries were going up between 1988 and 1999. So I published that. Well, it was interesting. The baseball medical people really did not like the article because it was showing that there were too many injuries. And of course, they took it personal in regards to saying, well, they must be the cause of that, which of course, that's not the case. But that's what got me into research. But I gave a talk at the winter meetings about this, and I really got kind of run off the stage. And I thought, that's my last article I'm ever going to write. Forget that. And but it got me on the road to thinking, why is it that baseball didn't have a database in regards to injuries? I mean, we had every other statistic in the world, but not injuries. So this kind of started me on the road to eventually helping and being part of a group that started the injury surveillance system in Major League Baseball that's now called the HIT system.
Yep.
And that started in really 2009. We started taking data in 2010 and 2011. And a lot of the research that I do is based a lot on that HITS data maturing and going over different years. So that's really what got me into research. I authored one article in 2001. I didn't author another one to 2010 because my hands were still hot from the stove. But since then, I've authored or co-authored 26 publications, including 17 since I left the Dodgers in 2016. So it's been fun.
I don't
I'm
think,
sorry, go ahead.
you know, I think, you know, I'm gonna blow some sunshine your way just because I think so many people are unaware. It's challenging to be a thought leader and a practitioner, but I think it's another thing altogether to be a prolific contributor to the body of knowledge. And, you know, that's what makes legacies, you know? So I do think there's something to be said. That's an important feather in your cap, particularly at this point in your career. So I commend you for taking that on.
Well, I gotta make sure everybody knows that I was a part of a lot of groups. Christopher Camp, who's a doctor out of Mayo Clinic and
Minnesota Twins.
with Minnesota Twins, Dr. Neil Elatrage and others really helped me to go along here. I had a lot of ideas because I was in the trenches of what information we needed, but they really helped me with the research.
I'm curious, and this spins off on it. Where do you think, has it been challenging at times? Because, and we both know, like, there are scenarios where there's roster manipulation or, guys not pitching well and all of a sudden he's got a mysterious calf strain.
Right.
Is a lot of the reporting something that you have to dig deeper than that? Or is it just the assumption that, hey, this happens with all 30 organizations, let's move on?
Well, one of the things, first of all, before we had the HIT system, prior to 2011, really, we used the disabled list. And the second paragraph in every publication is the disabled list is not an injury database. It is a roster management tool.
Yep.
And so, but one of the things that we found, and especially later on when we had the HITS data, that the DL over a long period of time is pretty accurate on actual real injuries.
Interesting.
The return to play is a little skewed because one, they had to stay on it for 15 days, even if they were better in 10 days. And as you said, the prolific phantom DL on a guy who, couldn't find the plate, all of a sudden had a big toe injury. But over a 5 or 10 year period, those sort of were absorbed in the data, and we were able to see the real injuries. That said, we knew we needed another system, and since the HITS data came out, it's pretty accurate. Now, there still can be some manipulation of the data, but when you're looking at daily reporting from athletic trainers and doctors on over 7,500 players every day, the data gets big enough so it allows us to really do see trends and get more accurate data. In addition, we've been able to even go past the data and look at information that's in the data that tells us even more. So it's been really prolific, really since about 2013, now all the way up, that you're seeing maybe 10 articles a year based out of the HITS data. So Major League Baseball really has done a good job in regards to this particular system, and has worked really hard to make sure that the athletic trainers know that they need to put in real data because it's the benefit of every team.
No doubt about it. Now, are there particular areas where you feel like your research and consulting interests have gone underneath the injury heading, like stuff that intrigues you the most?
Well, I think there's been a couple different studies that I've really, I don't know if it's the word proud or happy we did them. The one was a prevalence study with how many people in a year had a history of Tommy John surgeries. So a point in time we actually surveyed over 6,000 baseball players and asked them, have you ever had a Tommy John surgery? And this was really started by my assistant athletic trainer, Nancy Patterson Flynn, who kept saying, seems like we got a lot of guys who have had a Tommy John. How many? And she kept, I hate to use the word badger, I guess she badgered me, said, why can't we do this? So we tried to do with Major League Baseball. We looked at the HIT system. There really wasn't any information. But one of the things that is unique about Tommy John surgery is that everybody knows whether they had it or not. Mm-hmm. Some guys who have shoulder injuries, they went in and cleaned it up. I don't know what they did. Was it a slap tear? Was it a rotator cuff? But everybody not only knows, is proud that they've come back from Tommy John surgery. So we basically went out and asked all the players, and what we found was surprising, and that was 1 out of 4 major league players. This was in 2012. 1 out of 4 major league pitchers had a Tommy John surgery. Wow. Now, we repeated that study just recently in 2018, and what we found was it was about the same at the major league level, but it was much higher in the minor league level.
No doubt.
And this is one of the things that we've seen, and everybody kind of knows who follows this. I hate to use the word epidemic right now, but is that people are not only increasing the number of Tommy John surgeries that are being performed, but they're being performed on younger and younger players. Yep. And what we saw in the 2018 study was that the increase in Tommy John surgeries and history of Tommy John surgeries was occurring in the minor leagues, not in the major leagues. And this goes along with a couple other studies, one done by Dr. Chris Ahmad in New York and Dr. Tony Romeo. They did 2 separate studies and showed that the increase in the last years, really up until 2011, the increase was significantly higher in 15 to 19-year-olds. Yep. And this is what we're seeing, and this is with the clinic that we're running in Phoenix right now. What we're seeing is these 15 and 16-year-olds all coming in with UCL injuries. And there's a lot of, we can go into that if you'd like to in regards to why we think that is, but it's really disheartening. These kids at 15 and 16 having Tommy John surgery.
Well, I think it's even scarier too, because we're just speaking to UCL injuries, right? That doesn't even scream to, the kids who fracture a medial epicondyle or, have a severe ulnar neuritis or some, we're seeing kids in their teenage years having thoracic outlet now. It's pretty crazy how quickly this is going.
Yeah, it can be, it's the same old thing. We can prevent those for sure. Yeah. It's just that there's outside pressures in regards to what these kids have to go through and the pressure that's on them to produce and to increase velocity. I have not been around it except for the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it just seems terrible that these kids have to do this. And they keep saying, well, I keep telling them, no, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't pitch this much. You shouldn't do these. And they said, but I have to. I have to do this if I want to go to the next level. It's unbelievable.
I can speak from experience. We opened our facility in Massachusetts in 2007, and I can remember it was a huge deal to have a couple of high school kids hit 90. 88 to 90 was a really big deal back then. Nowadays, 88 to 90 makes you a Division II player, it seems like.
Yes, and it does.
Unless you've got an elite secondary stuff where people can see a high level of projectability for you, it's going to be a long road to becoming certainly a high round pick. To be a pick at all is a big deal at that velocity nowadays. So.
Well, it is sad. I worked with Santa Clara University for a couple of years. You got a taste of the college thing, and the pressure on them is so incredible. And if they're throwing 88 miles per hour and getting everybody out, it's not good enough. Mm-hmm. And they have to try to find ways to get to 92 or 93. Mm-hmm. And typically that goes with an increased risk of injury.
And it's funny, we had Kyle Hendricks on this podcast before, and I asked Kyle, do you think you could get drafted today? And he said no.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's worked out okay for him. But, I think it's interesting because you're in the private sector now, and we I actually, I think we chatted about this a little bit after the weighted ball roundtable at ASMI. It's not good enough just for us to sit on a panel and say weighted balls are evil, don't do them, because we know kids are still going to do them. We've got to find a way to, and Reinhold has talked about this, and we've got to find a way to, you kind of have to give the puppy the pill with the peanut butter, right? If you're going to give him some of the sexy stuff, there has to be a lot of fundamentally sound training principles and management of volume and intensity over the course of a competitive year to make it work.
I think it was interesting in that roundtable, which I think has gotten a lot of play because it was a great panel, was the information that Raphael from Sacramento State did that showed that weighted balls do increase velocity 2 to 4 miles per hour. A really good conditioning program with increased strength and better movement increases about 2 to 4 miles per hour. So the problem is you can do it. People just want the quick way and the magic bullet way. And instead of just going in and working hard and getting the right type of training and the right sequences to be a better player.
All things in moderation, right?
All right.
All right. So speaking of ASMI, they were outstanding. You had a couple presentations, and I really enjoyed it. You covered, hamstring stuff, but in particular, I thought a lot of your talk with respect to ulnar collateral ligament reconstructions, Tommy John, were particularly profound. So I think, maybe this leads into a good discussion of some of the norms that athlete can expect. Like you said, we're probably dealing in a scenario where 30 to 40% of professional players at this point have either had it, or unfortunately are headed towards it. There's a lot of research out there about, how long it takes for an ACL graft to mature, but there doesn't seem to be a definitive timeline on when a UCL graft actually becomes, that tendon becomes a ligament. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I've posed this question multiple times to Dr. Andrews and ask him, well, at 6 months, how strong do you think the graft is? And anybody who knows Dr. Andrews had a chance to listen to him speak or anything, he's about as honest as the day is long. He'd say in his southern drawl, I'm not going to do it justice, but I'll try it anyway. He said, well, hell, we just don't know that. And what's interesting is you bring up the ACL graft, which is somewhat of the model of what you might consider the maturity of a graft. You take a patellar tendon or you take a hamstring, you replace the ACL, you put drill holes in, you do all the stuff that you do in a UCL, and we know a lot about the maturity of that graft because we're able to go back in on a second look arthroscopically. And early on in the ACL graft studies, they were able to get biopsies and look at the cell exchange, between it going from being a tendon to being a ligament. And they watched that. And Frank Noyes from Cincinnati did a lot of the early research along with Doug Jackson out of Long Beach. And they showed basically it took a year to mature. Now, the one difference also between the UCL and the ACL is the UCL is not inside the joint. And the ACL actually is in the joint. It has synovial fluid around it, which actually makes it mature less quickly. But we're not able to biopsy the ligament in the elbow. We're not able to really know that. We think it's about a year based on some other studies on tendon repairs and that type of thing. But we actually really don't know. And this is some of the stuff that we looked at in regards to the rehab aspects. How fast do you go? When do you start doing things? When do you expect that they're going to be able to do this stuff? And we continue to try to look at this. So when we start looking at when can a guy first start throwing, when can he go, when should he be able to return to competition? And we generally in the beginning, Kevin Wilk out of ASMI in Birmingham has done more rehabs on UCLs than anybody in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he really started writing articles in 1990 along with Judy Saito from KJOC,
Yep.
and wrote really that you could start throwing at about 4 months. And it became sort of the gold standard that you could start throwing at 4 months. Well, what you got to remember is the UCL, the main purpose of a UCL is to allow somebody to throw.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a grocery store clerk, you don't need a UCL.
Yep.
If you're a mechanic, you don't need a UCL. Mm-hmm. But if you're a pitcher, you have to have a UCL or you can't throw. So throwing puts more stress on the ligament than any other activity in the world. So when do you start throwing and not knowing where the maturity of the ligament, the graft is? So Kevin Wilk got great results at about 4.5 months starting that. Mm-hmm. Then we started looking at it a little differently. Dr. Christopher Camp and I did a study on 1,400 UCL injuries, surgeries, actually reconstructions. And we looked at their natural history of how they went through. And we found out that the average time to return to play was 16 months. Another study was 18 months. Well, we looked at the 1,400, and what we found was there was a lot of outliers, quicker and longer, especially longer. So we used the median, so the halfway part, the median, and found that the average time of all these, the median number was 14 months.
Okay.
So we were thinking of getting these guys back in 11 or 12 months, but they really came back in 14 months. And one of the questions I've raised was, why is it 14 months? Is it because they're having setbacks? Mm-hmm. And I've read articles or listened to people talk, and especially media people saying, well, you always have a setback. So there's always a setback. Well, why should there be a setback if you're doing the rehab? Shouldn't be an automatic setback. So we started looking at whether or not, if the time is really 14 months, why are we throwing it 4.5 months? Mm-hmm. It just doesn't make any sense because you need more time to mature the ligament. Mm-hmm. So we started saying that maybe it's 5.5, 6 months. And I think that's sort of what most people are starting to do, is about 6 months, because you still have plenty of time.
Yeah.
You got 8 more months to be able to get them ready for competition.
Do you think the 14 months was impacted also by, let's say, for instance, a player blows out in June, right? He has the surgery July 1st, so you have a scenario where you might actually miss, closer to 2 years. And I know you use median instead of mean, but does it have a lot to do with what time of year the surgery takes place?
No question.
Yep.
The timing on all this stuff, and this is where some of the conservative care comes in. Do you have time to do conservative care where you only want to lose one baseball season and not 1.5 or 2?
Yep.
So if a player is ready to go, and this is one of the arguments have been on why maybe this is so long, is if, let's say, a guy is ready to play in December. He's rehabbed. He had it in September, October of the previous year. Now he's in December or even January, and he's ready to go. But there's no place to play. So then he has to wait 2 more months before he can get back into competition. So that makes the length longer. One of the great things about statistics, however, is the bigger your denominator, the more accurate you can be in regards to making assumptions. And with ours, it was 1,400 Tommy John surgeries. It was the biggest study ever done on UCL reconstructions. So we felt it was pretty good by dicing up the information that over 1,400, we would get a pretty good idea. That doesn't mean we're totally accurate with every one, though.
I think the other thing that's interesting about that 4 month time mark, and I probably still see more like 4.5 startups than, maybe that's just because the information hasn't disseminated, but, I actually like the 5 and 6 month mark a lot better, just because I do feel like it allows us to do a little bit more in the weight room than we otherwise would. Because when you're at 4 months, you're kind of just getting to that point where, a pretty strong athlete who's got a good training background might just be getting comfortable holding, 135 on a trap bar deadlift or something like that.
Yep.
You have those 2 months where you can actually test a little bit of grip stuff and do a little bit more like true strength training. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen guys that, have started their throwing programs before they've actually done any strength training. They've done rehab, they've done their plyo throws, but they've never actually like picked up any heavy stuff. So it's a
Well,
different world.
I think that's a great point,
Yeah,
because one of the things people said, well, what are you going to do between 4 months and 6 months? The guys are coming in every day, and what do you do to keep them busy?
hmm
And I would tell them, if they went to Eric Cressey's Performance Center, I bet you'd have a lot of things you could do for 2 months.
yeah,
And I think the movement patterns, and not just the strength training, but the integration into the movement that they're going to do, you need to start that as early as possible, and that is what's really going to help them when they actually start throwing and have mechanics. You're practicing that amount of using the entire kinetic chain.
hmm
So I'm sure in your place is the same as ours. Is that I've heard people go to physical therapy clinics for 45 minutes on a Tommy John. I mean, geez, it takes 45 minutes to warm them up.
yeah.
And it's 2 to 3 hours of working with every segment. You actually work with the elbow very little,
True.
mostly the scap, the shoulder, but again, this whole integration of lower extremity through the pelvis and the core up through the scapula, and that's takes a lot of time and work for the player to do that.
The other thing I've noticed, and I'm curious to get your take on it, is certainly we know certain approaches to a UCL reconstruction can be more aggressive with respect to how like the flexor tendon is treated during the surgery, and
Yep.
some athletes are more susceptible to tendinopathy as they work their way back. Definitely in those scenarios, I've always seen the kind of the 7 to 8 month mark as being like a very vulnerable time, because they've gotten much stronger in the weight room. There are kind of no restrictions in that regard. Meanwhile, they're still doing a high volume of rehab, and then they're also ramping up their throwing program. And it's all happening right at the same time, where
Yep.
proactively in those situations, a lot of times I'll minimize the amount of gripping we actually do in the weight room, just because I know those other two entities are going to take a lot of the stress. And I actually wonder if starting throwing later for more athletes allows you to not kind of hit that all at the same time.
Well, that kind of goes to a study that we presented at the ASMI, and that study by Keller that looked at 317 or so UCL reconstruction pitchers, and what they found is that 45% experienced medial L pain during their rehab. And when they looked at it, the average time goes along with just what you just said, is that the average time that they started to have medial elbow pain was at 9.75 months.
Wow.
Okay. And so, so what does that mean? So they had a little medial elbow pain at 9 months. They ended up coming back. Well, this study looked again at 300 people. That's a pretty good sample size. Almost 20% of the people who had that medial elbow pain, ended up having subsequent elbow surgeries, and only 7% who had no pain ended up with surgeries. So this idea of having pain in your elbow or having a setback like being no big deal, it is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so what are the factors that might go into that? Strength not being enough, maybe a guy who has had a tendinopathy before, you got to be a little bit more careful as you ramp them up, all those kinds of things, or throwing too soon, throwing too hard, not knowing how hard the player is throwing and monitoring his velocity. All those things are really, really important. And you don't get a chance to get a redo.
Yeah.
You don't get a chance to say, "Oh, we went too fast. Now we're going to lose 3 weeks." You can't do that.
I get my my chops busted around the facility for having a lot of what they call Cresseyisms. So lines like, small hinges swing big doors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But one that I always find myself using with respect to Tommy John rehabs is the best way to get out of a hole is to stop digging. And what I speak to with guys is, don't let that one day where it's a little sore and you're not feeling like gung ho to throw, like you can push a day back. It's such a long rehab timeline. And I'll always always tell guys,
Yeah.
hey, it doesn't matter whether you're Corey Kluber or Steven Strasburg or whoever it is. Major league pitchers, they might make 33 starts in a year. They're going to have a couple clunkers. Like, you're allowed to not be at your best 8 to 10% of the time. So on those days, you just buy yourself an extra day. Maybe you get some manual therapy, you get some extra sleep, you eat a little bit more, and you relax, and you come back the next day and you're better. I think a lot of the setbacks we see are guys that think that's normal, that they need to
Yes.
push through it and get, they're breaking up scar tissue or something like that. And that's very rarely the case.
Well, very interesting. We saw a player today, pitcher today, who was about a year out of Tommy John surgery and still having trouble. So he came to us to take a look at it and see if we can do anything. And so we, of course, go through the history and everything else. And we said, well, when did the pains first start? Started about 3 months ago. Okay, what did they do? How did they decide to do this? Well, they told me that it was normal. I should just throw through it and the pain would go away.
Yeah.
And I said, no, you're kidding me, right? He said, no. I said, so we did it. And then they said, no, you better take some time off. Gave him 2 days off and threw him back throwing. And he's had problems for 4 months. So, it is funny, some of the so-called truisms and myths that go along, just pop the scar tissue and you'll be okay. I mean, geez, I don't want scar tissue popping. I really don't. And so you have to navigate, and it's hard when you're working with a player for a year and a half. You have to be able to look where he's at, where he's going, where to back off, where to push forward. It is not a protocol. Any of you people out there using a protocol for UCL because they're all the same, please stop, throw it away, start again.
Yep.
Listen to your players, make sure you know what's going on, look at the timelines. Not everybody rehabs the same way.
There's a human element that you definitely have to take into account. And so I'm curious, you spoke to obviously the onset of between 4 and 6 months, depending on, maybe how much you adhere to the old stuff versus the new stuff and, approaches that are out there. But where do, different, I guess, milestones come in? What about flat grounds? What about mound work? What's the average that you're seeing?
Well, we looked at, we were able to get, of the 1,400 Tommy Johns we did, we tried to spin off another study where we were actually able to look at notes from athletic trainers that showed when people started throwing. And we were able to find throwing records on 580 of them. And so we went through those and started accumulating data on when do they first start throwing, when they throw flat ground, when do they first throw changeups, and so on. So let me just give you the numbers that we have. Unfortunately, we haven't published this right now because I'm too lazy or not motivated enough to write the paper. Kevin will call me.
21 publications, since 2007? You're doing okay for yourself.
Yeah, but Kevin Will calls me all the time and says, when are you going to write that stupid article? And so I really need to do that. But the interesting out of these, and these are different timelines too. This was actually, we looked at people really from about 1986 all the way up. So some of these were far back, some of them were more recent. So that influences the numbers. The time to first throwing was 4.7 months, which kind of goes along with Kevin Wilkes' stuff. I think those numbers will change when we get more numbers of the last 10 years rather than just before. With flat ground, which is interesting because everybody has a different definition of flat ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
But flat ground, we decided that flat ground was throwing down to a catcher on flat ground. So other people will have different definitions, but that's why we use that. And interesting, flat ground was thrown less, at least talked about less in the notes, was 9.5 months. And mound work started at 9.2 months. Now, this is an interesting one in regards to flat ground and mound work. And, we always waited till the mound work was, almost the last thing you did because it was the most dangerous. Mm-hmm. Well, there's been some good studies, one by Slinker, which is out of Curlin Jove and Neil Elytrage, that showed that the mound actually may have some protective value in it. Absolutely. And that there's not much less stress on the graft from flat ground to throwing on the mound. Well, the last time I looked, professional baseball players in college and high school throw off a mound. So mechanically, you want to get as much work off the mound as you can. But what happens when you take a guy who's had surgery and said, okay, we're going to go on the mound today? Well, I mean, adrenaline's flowing out of his veins like an unbelievable amount. And what he does is he gets on the mound and he throws as hard as he can. What we have to do is understand that velocity equals torque on the ligament or the graft. It's directly related. The harder you throw, the more stress you put on the ligament. So what you have to do is monitor the throwing, and we use a radar gun. You could use motor sleeve. You can use other devices that help you know about how far they're throwing or how hard they're throwing, and teach them how to throw mechanically correct at 60 miles an hour, at 65 miles an hour. And you teach them that. So when you get them on the mound, you say, listen, you're going to throw at 70, 75 miles an hour. You're not going to throw 1 mile an hour after that. And you monitor them and you teach them that. What's amazing that I've learned over the last 5 years of doing this is the pitchers are incredible. They can get within plus or minus 2 miles an hour almost right away once they're taught and given the feedback. So now, instead of using the radar gun as a bad thing to try to light up the radar gun, you can actually use the radar gun to control the stress you're putting on the new graft. And that's what we do. So when we get to 70, 75 miles an hour, that's pretty firm at 60 feet. Then we go ahead and put them on the mound, but we keep them at 70 miles per hour. If you let them go up, you defeated the purpose. The more you can get on the mound, the more you can work on your mechanics. The more you work on your mechanics, the more efficient you are. The more efficient you are, the way the kinetic chain works will decrease the stress on the shoulder and the elbow.
I love it. Now, so that's flat ground, that's mound work. What about breaking pitches? I know you alluded in your talk to some discussions on when changeups come into play. What's your take on those?
First of all, changeup is the first one that the off-speed throw that's thrown, and that's probably because a lot of the literature actually says, changeup are a little less stress on the ligament than other pitches. That's at 10.3 months. So that's the first one.
Are you to be clear, are you okay with guys playing catch with their changeup as they're working their way back through the
Yes, absolutely.
Because we'll see that quite a bit. Okay.
Yeah. And then as far as the first game action, which I consider a simulated game, that was 11.7 months.
Okay.
So, and if you see that the average simulated game was 11.7 months, it's going to take at least 30 to 45 more days before you get a guy ready for competition. So, that gets you back closer to that 14-month period. So, it kind of all works together.
Where do breaking balls fit in? I know they've been maybe excessively vilified at times.
Probably unfairly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I had all my numbers. I didn't have breaking ball. I think it was breaking balls 10.6 months, just shortly after.
That's not bad. So let's talk about typical return to previous level of competition. We've seen the numbers cook dramatically. What's the true success rate on a Tommy John? It
depends on who you read.
Yeah.
How's that? And it depends on the sample size and what the year you're doing it and how big the sample size is. The first real study on this on return to play was done by Lyle Kane out of ASMI, where he looked at professional college and high school that came through Jimmy Andrews' operating room probably, and he had a 83% success rate throughout the whole. The professional athletes in that study, which was done in 2010, their numbers weren't as good, like 75%. Got back to return to play. And now let's also talk about that, because return to play means actually going out there. The second part of that is return to your previous level of performance.
Yep.
And then finally, it's return to your previous level of performance from a statistical standpoint, meaning velocity and everything else.
Yep.
So if a Major League Baseball player has Tommy John and he comes back to AAA, he doesn't reach his previous level. So those numbers are lower. An A-ball player, a AA player who doesn't get back to AA, they don't meet those requirements. So return to competition is very, very good in regards to actually throwing in a game or throwing in general, off a mound. Those are in the 90 percentiles. there are two studies that are the best studies that I know of that have big sample size and give us good numbers on professional athletes. One is Erickson's study in 2015, showed an overall 82% excellent rate, which is good, 8% good, and an 86% return to play. He doesn't talk necessarily about return to a previous level of performance in this. But also he did some collegiate athletes that showed that return to sport was 95%. These are really, really good numbers. And there's a lot of reasons why people don't return. Sometimes guys, especially on the professional level, if they're minor league players, they don't get another job.
Yep.
Or they quit, or they just decide that's not enough for them. So there's a lot of different reasons other than the elbow that cause these numbers to go down. We think 82, 83% is really good numbers for this type of surgery with a year of rehab and everything else, especially at the college level, which almost all of them are over 90%. The other article I kind of like because I'm an author on it with Christopher Camp in the 1400s, we saw an 83.7 return replay to any level of play. But interesting to the prior level, 72.8, 73%. So you see that drops. So when somebody says, "Oh, our return rate is 90%," absolutely. Return to throwing off the mound, 90%.
Yeah.
No, but I think I've said this before at different lectures. At the professional level, we don't care if they can throw.
Yeah.
We got to know whether they compete and do as well as they can do to get people out. After that, we don't care. Unfortunately. And so that's when you see these 83. With all the different studies, the number 83 seems to be a magic numbers with different studies on different population. So the number is 83%, which is a damn good number.
Yep. 5 out of 6 are good. And I think this is honestly, this is an important aside, even though it's something that probably shouldn't have to be said. Of all the listeners on this show, I guarantee you there will be one father out there that still thinks that he should send his kid for Tommy John so that he throws harder. Can we throw that myth out and verify, in fact, that because of these numbers, there is no guarantee you will come back better. And more importantly, we both know that a native UCL is always going to be stronger than a replacement UCL.
Right.
And I think that's an important iteration. And no matter how many times it's said, someone out there still has that misconception.
Yeah, no, it is funny, what the perception of Tommy John surgery is. And we've done 2 studies. There've been 2 studies on this. One done by Chris Ahmad, who, I can't remember the year, it was in the mid 2015, about 2015. He asked parents, coaches, and college players, could you increase performance by having Tommy John on an elbow who was not hurt? And it was unbelievable. Mm-hmm. I think 31%. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I should have had it. 31% of the coaches thought it was okay, but it was like almost 40% of the parents thought it was okay to have a surgery on your kid that didn't need the surgery in order to get performance. We did another one right after that. Chris Ahmad and I was very fascinated with the study. So I said, why don't we repeat it and let's ask the same questions you asked to the parents and the coaches. Let's ask the media, the baseball media. And we did about 500 media people, and the numbers were almost identical. They still thought that it was okay. Now, the question always is, and the response to this is always, well, what about Schmaltz? What about so-and-so? He came back throwing harder. One, there's been several studies that looked at Tommy John surgeries and whether they return to their previous level of velocity. And the answer is no. And part of the reason that some people think that is that you see a guy who threw 92 and he comes back from Tommy John and he's throwing 93. Now, why could that be? How about a year of conditioning and strengthening and working and also taking a year off abusing his elbow and shoulder? Yeah,
people don't realize that your comparison may have been a structurally unstable elbow that hurt miserably and went to flexion contractures after every outing. Sometimes just not hurting can make you throw harder.
Yeah. It's just people unfortunately want to hear what they want to hear. Yep. And it's just hard when you talk to parents with 16-year-olds. and say he doesn't need to do this showcase. And they say, well, we have to get seen. I said, let me tell you something about baseball scouting at the professional level. If you're out in the middle of East Africa throwing a rock across a stream and skipping it at 92 miles an hour, there's a scout with a radar gun behind you. Don't worry. If you're good, they will find you. You don't need to go pay money to do showcases just to be seen.
We've got a lot of research to demonstrate that I think it's 6 times higher incidence of injury in athletes that compete in showcases than those that don't. Really good studies.
Yes.
So build on that. So we just talked about UCL repairs, but let's talk about revisions, right? First question, are they increasing or are they decreasing? This is confusing stuff.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've looked at, the numbers are increasing. Why are the numbers increasing? So we got to talk about that. Well, this is because more people are having Tommy John surgery every year. So now you have a bigger pool of people to look at the population. And so also the success of the Tommy John surgery and the reconstruction allows players to play for a long time. And some of those people need revisions 6, 7, 8 years post Tommy John surgery because they've pitched for 7 years at a high level and they've worn out that graft too.
Yep.
So we have that. The problem with some of the revision studies that first came out, and I'll say that a couple of them are mine, we looked at really small sample sizes and we made big assumptions. And we started looking at revision rates of 13 or 14%. And it was because we used a small study because there weren't that many revisions. We got smarter and waited till there was more revisions, and we looked at 68 of them, which is a big number for revisions, and looked at them, and we found that from guys who had Tommy John surgery, the revision rate is only 6.7%. Erickson did also another study on revisions, and his population it was a little bit smaller, but showed 7.2. So about 6%, 7% of Tommy Johns that keep going on, that are successful, will have a second one.
Yeah, I was going to say, when are those failing? Because, certainly there are going to be some that fail in the first year for whatever reason. Are those included in those numbers, or are we talking about guys that are 5 years later?
No, we divide them into 3 different columns, basically. One, there's a high number that happened within 2 years. That means that surgery wasn't going to work, and you can blame whoever we want, the player, the rehab, the surgeon. You can do whatever, but there's a percentage of people who don't make it to the second year and need a revision. There's also guys who are 7 years and above. That's the biggest number of revisions. And then there's some people in the middle. So I was very interested in 2014. We saw I think we saw 12 revisions that year in the major league level. And I noticed that more than half of them failed within 2 years of their surgery. That's when I actually started thinking about throwing, and maybe we were throwing too soon, throwing too hard, not monitoring it. Fortunately, I was wrong, because then that just was a blip on the screen, and most of these fail, 6, 7 years out. You also got to remember that most people have Tommy John, the other 93% go on, have good careers, go home because they're retired or they've lost the ability to make a team. And they go on and have great lives and everything's good. So again, when you look at the 7% revision rate, that means 93% are not having revisions.
I'm curious also, as we talk about, outcomes, does it differ based on whether we're talking about a modified Job or a docking technique? I believe you spoke to that a little bit at ASMI. I'd love to get your take on experiences with both approaches to the surgery.
Well, there's been a lot of studies done on trying to compare the modified Job procedure, which is a figure 8, versus a docking procedure, where on the proximal side, typically you use an interference screw instead of multiple drill holes. And most people now have kind of shifted toward the docking procedure, but the modified 8 has shown to be good too. when you look at return rates, the docking is a little bit better, but not statistically significantly better. So both are really, really good. They've also looked at graphs, the palmaris longus graph versus gracilis graph. People seem to think from different studies that the ipsilateral, meaning the same side, throwing side of the palmaris longus, is a pretty darn good graph. The gracilis graft is a lot of times a bigger graft, used a lot more in the revisions, mostly because in the first surgery they took the palmaris longus, so now they're using the gracilis. I think Jimmy Andrews more than anybody else, but other people think sometimes that the gracilis graft might be too big. It needs to be trimmed down and use that. But I think still people use the palmaris longus graft, which is the traditional one, more often than anything else, and they feel that's good. But I think the docking procedure is being more used commonly, but the studies show that if you look at number to number, percentage of return to play, the docking is a little bit better, but the modified Job is still really, really pretty good. So it really depends on the surgeon and what confidence they have in that particular surgery.
I'll say this. I know, I'm going to guess you might agree with me as you've been more and more involved on the strength and conditioning side of things alongside physical therapy over the last couple of years, but I'll take a palmaris longus graft over a lower extremity graft any day just because it's a miserable time when athletes are bored after an elbow surgery. And when you do that gracilis graft, instead of being back in the weight room doing some stuff with your lower body 2 weeks post-op, you're super limited. You're going to be really careful about kind of the graft site. It's a little achy for a while. Like it just makes that first, kind of from the 2 week mark to the 3 month mark, just so much easier from a trainability standpoint. I'll take palmaris longus any day of the week.
I agree with you. I mean, players who have it, they said, I'd have another Tommy John before they could take my other gracilis. I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about repair versus reconstruction, since some of the people you're talking to are going to see high school and college people. First of all, the repairs with augmentation. I'm not going to go too much into the surgery, so everybody can look that up, and I think everybody knows about it. But this is coming back. The primary repair used to be done and was sort of abandoned because the reconstruction became so good. And Jeff Dugas out of Birmingham really kind of reinvented this and put it back on the map, along with other people. But the idea is not to reconstruct, meaning put drill holes and put a tendon in for the graft, but to actually fix a partial tear of the ligament. And this seems to work best on high school and college younger players because they don't have the wear and tear on the ligament, and generally the ligament is in good shape except for one part, and they basically reattach that to the bone. I'm making things pretty simple. And then they use a suture to kind of make it a little bit stronger. What we've seen a lot we're in the middle of a study. It's a 5-year study, which is probably going to end at 3 years because the colleges just stopped this year. So we had a 5-year study going, and we had completed 3, but we're not going to get through this year because the college season has abruptly stopped. But what we saw the first year was only about 9% of all the surgeries that were done at the Division I level baseball were repairs. All the others were reconstruction. The second year, we saw about 16%.
Interesting.
Last year, we saw 25%.
I like it.
So the difference between the repair and the reconstruction, the biggest thing is that it's quicker to return. You can return in 6 months versus 14 months. But I want to caution everybody, the key is the surgeon doing the right surgery for the right person and the right tear. And this is big because the repair, if you ask a player, hey, do you want to go for the 14-month program or the 6-month program? It's a no-brainer. The question is whether or not you're a candidate for that, because if you do a repair on a bad ligament, it will fail. And most surgeons will tell the player, before they go into surgery, I'm going to open this up. I'm going to look at the ligament. If it looks like I think it's going to look at it, I'm going to repair it. But if it's not, I'm going to reconstruction.
Yep.
So some of these guys wake up thinking they're going to have a repair, but it's a reconstruction because the ligament isn't right. And you have to really, really trust the surgeon. And Dr. Dugas is really good about saying this to everybody. It's like, this is not for everybody.
Yeah.
But the repair is something that the high school and college people should at least entertain, but you need to go to a surgeon that has done quite a bit of these, not just to someone who's doing it for the first time.
Actually, Dr. Dugas and I spoke at a conference together last week, and this was kind of the theme of his presentation. It was outstanding. I think we need to get him on for a subsequent podcast to look into a lot deeper. But and also George Paletta, the Cardinals team doctor, is also doing a lot of these as well. So I'm curious. So we jumped around and we talked about that. How do you feel like UCL revisions fare longer term with respect to the previous level of competition? So we talked about, first Tommy John's coming back at, that 83% clip kind of being a gold standard. What is it for a second one?
Let me just pull out the numbers here. Again, I should know these because I helped write the article.
It's all good.
I know.
I mean, obviously the success rate is lower, and you're dealing with surgical complications because you're talking about a medial epicondyle that's been drilled before, and there's concerns on that front, correct?
Right, absolutely. The revision is not as successful. I'm just trying to pull up the numbers here, which is terrible here.
That's all right. What are the challenges that you face with a second go around? I mean, especially when you know that players they've been through the rehab before, they kind of know what to expect, but it's a longer timeline and unique circumstances.
Yeah. You have to keep all sharp objects away from them after they have the surgery because they can't believe they did it again.
Yeah.
It's much slower. You're looking at 16 to 18 months, although the numbers are actually better on return to play. I'm sorry I took so long to get this, but return to any play, and this was based on 95 revisions that we looked at. So that's a pretty big number.
Yeah.
80% to return to any play. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. But to the previous level, it dropped down to 63%. And the average time to return to the previous levels was only 14.4 months, so it didn't last as long. We saw early on people were holding them back because they had a revision, and the more later ones, they just were getting back and doing it 14 months. But again, the previous level was pretty low. But to any level, now what we're talking about is a professional athlete, professional pitcher, getting back to the professional level. And that was 80%. So that's not as bad. I will tell you one thing that we've seen in reconstructions, I'm going to digress a little bit here, is catchers. Mm-hmm. Catchers, first of all, just get beat up. I mean, when I look at epidemiology of injuries, of whatever the injury is, I go to catchers and they always have the highest percentage of injuries. And on 90% of all the reconstructions done are on pitchers. Only 10% are on position players. But when you look at catchers, they only return at 55%. So that's way under the 83% the pitchers do. And you think, well, a catcher, he's not a pitcher. Catchers, if you run into a catcher, buy him a beer. Because boy, oh boy, these guys just got beat up. And I was shocked to see such a low level. We didn't have a huge number on them, about 30 catchers, but it was pretty consistent. These guys had a hard time coming back from Tommy John surgery.
That's interesting. So I'm curious. So obviously we're gonna wrap this up here in the next few minutes, but we always like to do a lightning round. We ask a couple questions of you. So this is off the cuff. You say the first thing that comes to mind. So have some fun with it. Give your advice to Stan Conte, let's say 20 years ago, getting out in the baseball world. What would you go back in time and tell yourself if you could go back?
Read more, listen better. And find somebody that you really trust and listen to everything they say.
That's all, and that's good advice for up and coming physical therapists, strength and conditioning
Oh
coaches,
God, yeah.
athletic trainers as well.
Yeah.
Second one? What was the biggest surprise? So I always hear about the surprises from people who come from the private sector into pro ball, and obviously I did that this year, so I'm seeing things from the inside. What about for
Yeah.
you, leaving pro ball to go to the private sector? What was the biggest surprise for you?
Well, first of all, I had been in the private sector before, so I
True.
knew what I was getting into, which
Coming
means
back
I
to
was stupid enough to come back to it. So I would say stupidity in coming back. But just to qualify the question a little bit more is
Mhm.
my first thing going into baseball from the private sector was I was a lot stupider than I thought I was. I was really thought I had a handle on things, and I did not. And so this return to play is where a lot of physical therapists fail. They're able to do the treatments, they're able to get the range of motion, some of the strength, but the return to play is where they falter.
That's interesting. And I guess the other one that I'm actually really intrigued to hear about is it. So all the time I get asked by students who are doing masters or PhD research, what do I want to study? You know, like if I could go do a research study in respect to the baseball world, what would I like to see? I'm curious if you could design any study and it would be no effort on your part. You just want to know the answers. What would you study right now?
Wow. Wow.
Or
You kind of got me.
what are some
I mean,
uncharted territories with respect to injury related research that intrigue you right now?
well, I think we need a lot more information on performance metrics in regards to return to play,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's been some studies that have started that, but it's not the studies aren't multifactorial.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they pick velocity, they pick spin rate, they pick different things, uh, WHIP or ERA, which are
Yep.
bad ones, and
Yep.
so I think we need more artificial intelligence to be able to put multivariate studies together to really get the answer instead of just talking one dimensionally.
Well said. All right. So tell me about what you and your son, Nick, who's also a PT, ATC, CSCS, you guys have got some cool stuff in the works out in Phoenix. So tell us about it.
Conte Sport Performance Therapy, CSPT, we started talking about it a couple years ago, and we were a little frustrated with the level of physical therapy on baseball players specifically, and with the restrictions in regards to payment and time and everything else. Uh, we just thought it could be done better, so we decided that we were going to try to put together a clinic that was more like a professional training room, and we decided to treat mostly baseball players, but definitely only athletes. So we weren't going to do the general population. We were going to hit a niche, try to do a really good job on it. Mm-hmm. And we have, and it's been, a fun time to do this stuff. We've got a lot of things. Any new business, as you know, any business, doesn't matter what the business is, it's brutal at the beginning. You're grinding, you try to get going, and we're starting to get some momentum on this. We have we spend 2 to 3 hours, as you do with your players, working on that. That's not a real great business plan, by the way, but we go one-on-one, and our whole concept here is it's not the exercises. They're important, and what you're doing is that you do them correctly.
Exactly.
And integrate normal motion from toe to finger. And that means you have to be on top of somebody doing exercise. If you give, like some places will give you a list of exercise, or I like this one, an iPad. Here's an iPad. Go do that exercise. Come back when you're done. During that time, they're developing poor patterns while they do the exercises. So you have to be right there saying, no, come back here. I want your pelvis here. I want to do this. I want you to move this way. No, I don't want you to rotate your back. You need to do all these kinds of things. And I think some of the stuff that hopefully Nick won't hear this, but Nick has got a really nice idea in regards to integration of movement, using some activities, closed kinetic chain, and some PRI type things in regards to bear crawls and total motion movements, and not just throwing the med ball against the wall, but actually starting with your feet rotating and pelvis forward and not rotating and being able to get the most efficient movement that then transfers right to hitting and throwing.
That's awesome.
And changing those patterns, damn, it's hard. It's hard.
You're not kidding. Well, you guys are doing a great job, and I know you got some really good momentum on your side. It's located in Phoenix. It's Conte Performance, CONTE Performance.com. And folks,
Right.
I'm also going to give you a shout out on your Twitter. I always look to your Twitter stuff for regular updates on research that comes out, and it's a wealth of information. So that's Stan Conte on Twitter. Just your name all lowercase. So
Yep.
This was outstanding, Stan. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and all the experience that you've acquired over a couple decades in professional baseball. So thanks for taking the time.
Eric, very, very nice. This is really, I've had this is a fun conversation.
We'll do it again sometime, all right?
All right.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.